Hello and welcome back to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill. I'm your host, Ramsey Nasser. This year we are focusing on sustainability in scholarly publishing, including the humanities and beyond. But what does sustainability look like in scholarly publishing? Today we find out. Stay with us. Discussions about diversity in higher education, when thinking about people, are tangible and familiar, perhaps sometimes too familiar. But what about the content of the research itself? How can research itself be made more diverse, more sustainable, or responsible? Can such a thing exist? Are there best practices in responsible research? Are there exemplars of sustainability in research that we should all emulate? Can practices of research and innovation themselves be transformed in any lasting way, or are any gains destined to be merely ephemeral? To help us answer these questions and more about responsible research, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Siri Granum-Carson and Matthias Kaiser. They are chapter authors, including co-authors of the chapter, A Sea Change in Science and Technology Ecologies, Prospects for Socially Responsible Research and Innovation Towards 2030, which is in the book edited by Anne Blanchard and Giovanni De Grantis, called The Fragility of Responsibility, published very recently by De Gruyter Brill. Doctors Carson and Kaiser, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
It's so nice to have you with us. I have to admit, I was completely ignorant about this topic until I read your chapter. And I have so many questions. So in the introduction to the book, it defines responsible research and innovation, RRI, as an attempt to improve the adaptivity of scientific information to socioeconomic realities. But it doesn't really go much further than this. Can you help explain to us a little bit about what RI stands for, what this means, and maybe even give us some examples of it in practice?
Sure. I mean, the term, I guess it's a kind of a European Commission invention, one out of a series of attempts by the research innovation system to try to make sure that science and innovation leads to socially desirable outcomes, and it's responsible, ethical. We have things like LC and ELSA, ethical, legal, and social aspects or implications of research that came up around the time of the rise of the gene technology research, and where you really started to feel the need to find new ways of making sure that reflections about ethics and responsibility is integrated into the research. And things like, which other terms do we have, Matthias? We have.
Well, there were many terms around, and it was always about, science in society, science with and for society. And I would say, Siri, and I think we agree on that, I mean, the whole term, responsible research and innovation, RRI, is meant to contextualize a body of knowledge, right? To place it in a specific historical, social, political context and technological context, right? So that we get out of the idea that it's just some numbers on a paper or on a computer or some abstract notion that is then handed over to something else. They evolve with and they contribute to a historical and social political dynamic. And to see this thing together, I think that was the intention of coming up with a term like that, responsible research and innovation. Don't you agree, Siri?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that also you see terms like open science and mission-oriented research and innovation, more recent terms that are attempts to deal with some of the same issues. So in a way, it's the different ways of trying to deal with this contextualization of science, research and innovation.
One of the issues that comes up regularly in your article about responsible research is the promotion of transdisciplinarity. You write that, quote, Scientific and technical knowledge has become more and more specialized. Millions of annually published scientific articles seldom meet the expectations of actionable knowledge. Outputs from disciplinary silos suffer typically from tunnel view. Even technoscience and technology seldom produce innovation which is robust in socio-cultural environments, end quote. I don't want to date myself too much, but I've always thought in terms of interdisciplinarity. What would be the difference between interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity? Why is transdisciplinarity important? And how central is transdisciplinarity to responsible research and innovation? What is RI beyond transdisciplinarity?
Just to start with your first question about from inter to trans, I think that the steps are often sort of presented as you go from multidisciplinarity via interdisciplinarity to transdisciplinarity, where you have multidisciplinarity is about, say you have a project with different disciplines involved working in parallel to solve some question, but of course without really interacting. And then interdisciplinarity, as the term suggests, is where the disciplines start sort of really interacting and maybe finding new forms of knowledge in the places between the disciplines. And then transdisciplinarity is about sort of also leaving the silos of academia. So interdisciplinarity, you are in a sense still within the ivory tower of academia, but to solve these issues of contextualization, to make sure that science is directed at solving the real societal issues and so on, you need to go beyond that. You need to get involved. You need to get the research involved with other sectors. You need to work closer with both public sector and private sector. You need to involve citizens, civil society into the research, not just as sort of clients for your research or receivers on the other end, but as taking part in research and innovation.
Basically, I have always stressed that one of the major differences between interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity is, of course, what you said, Siri. Interdisciplinary stays within the academic environment, right? They're all academics and from different fields. Transdisciplinary goes beyond, being more inclusive. It includes more knowledge systems. There is other ways of having knowledge that are not represented by the academic disciplines, and it includes what I call the multiplicity or diversity of value landscapes. So there's an ethical and an epistemic component to that. That is, in transdisciplinarity, we open up to listen to the valuable knowledge, let's say, of fishermen. That is practical knowledge, right? Or in particular, in many countries, like also in Norway with the Sami people, we would open up for indigenous knowledge systems, and we get into an active dialogue that is included. We are not studying them, but we are studying with them. And the same goes for the value diversity. We are not trying to be normative from an academic or philosophical point of view, but we want to listen to see what is the basic moral orientation and how can that come in studying this or that subject. If I may add one more comment, because you started out with the sustainability issue, right? And this is the large background for all of that. Last year, the United Nations estimated that only roughly 16% of all the sustainability goals are achieved. And there is basically no chance that we can achieve all of them by 2030. Now, there is many factors coming in. There's a pandemic and there's political turbulence, all of that. But part of that is also due to a failure in the sciences. We have been too narrow-minded, but we had very often this tunnel view of the silos, of the disciplinary silos, and thought, oh, I have a solution. But it was never fit for the complexity of real-life issues. And that is what we try when we do transdisciplinary research to overcome. We want to include the complexity from the very start, right? So by design, it's already in there. And that is the great ambition of transdisciplinary research.
This concept of inclusion that you emphasize, it's very much a part of the RI agenda. So it's a very important element of it. And transdisciplinarity is, in a way, you could say, seen from the perspective of researchers, the only way to achieve this inclusion. And also this aspect of becoming more reflexive, sort of understanding our own narrow perspectives and expanding them and so on, is also something that we need transdisciplinarity to achieve.
Your article, and in fact the whole book, comes out of something called the Afino Center. You write that the program that funded it was meant to challenge the Norwegian research and innovation system through dedicated funding of transdisciplinary projects. And you describe the Afino Center as a, quote, 5-year spa treatment, allowing for testing out of new learning areas that point beyond the traditional scientific training, end quote. What do you mean by this? What did the Afino Center do? And how was it like a spa?
Well, it was certainly very refreshing, right, Matthias?
It was all the time, actually, yes.
The point of saying it is that it was refreshing in the sense that it was something new. That it was the Research Council of Norway trying out something new. Afino was just part of that. This center, there's also the other center called Digital Life Norway, and many other funded projects through this Samansvar funding series from the Research Council, co-responsibility, this means. So it was about testing out new ways of working both across the disciplines and with private and public sectors to specifically challenge the old ways of doing things. And this Afino Center, it was funded as a hub and some projects, a few projects that were funded together with the hub and were meant to work across so that we would collaborate on testing out new learning arenas, pilot projects meant to see how we can work in different ways, and also with more leeway to make adjustments along the way, with less strict sort of milestones than deliverables and those kind of things. More room to test out things, really.
And it was like, like a spa. You can come in with different ailments and from different perspectives. Like, we had many projects from very different areas, right? It goes to research on aquaculture, on medical applications, and all of that. And in any case, and they had very different ideas about, for example, involving users, reaching out to some of them called stakeholders, interacting with society, right? And also ideas about, what could be the final outcomes? How do we evaluate them? And so these were different projects. They were sort of like hooked onto this spa, linking up with this center and a group of other projects and other people. And we would sort of activate, in that case, more interdisciplinary dialogue between them and say, hey, we can learn from each other. What are our ambitions and what are the realities? And in particularly the younger researchers, those that were, writing a PhD or were just postdocs, they had a lot of ambitions, but how can they realize that in practice? So we try to give training and to dialogue between them that would be helpful. And that was the SPA treatment. The SPA itself learned a lot, right, Siri? I mean, we were also in a continuous development here. Yeah.
Absolutely. But I do think that you indicate that maybe the most important outcome of the center was this training across all these different PhDs and postdocs coming out of very, very different disciplines and working on very different fields and projects, that they sort of made a network between them for researchers who have this kind of want to address these kind of issues, so that they have each other. So I think that's something that can make a lasting impact on the research community in Norway and beyond.
I understand, sadly, from the Afino website that funding was discontinued, and that the book, as per the words of the website itself, was published as a swan song. You write in your chapter, quote, "Our fear was that declining interest in RRI and CSR would bring with it a regrettable loss. The importance of responsibility and agency was at risk of being disregarded. The practice of responsibility is difficult, demanding, and fragile," end quote. In fact, the book itself is called The Fragility of Responsibility. What is so fragile about responsible research and innovation? Does its fragility have any remedies? You also lament the lack of dedicated funding for transdisciplinarity. What can dedicated funding achieve that cannot be taken up by institutional or researcher self-initiative?
So the fragility, I guess it's the context this is written in is a situation of lack of funding for this kind of initiatives, not just in Norway, but in Europe. That I guess is mainly due to financially a more demanding situation. So the fragility maybe consists in seeing this form of alternative ways of doing research and innovation as a kind of luxury that you can do when times are good and you have some extra cash floating around that you can spend on let's do something fun, let's make a center for transdisciplinarity. Whereas, I mean, the situation is really that we need, for the reasons that Matthias mentioned about sustainability goals and all these kind of different grand social challenges that we face, we really need to do things differently. And when there's no time or money to test out alternative ways of doing things, then it becomes, of course, very fragile.
I have a chapter earlier in the book where I sort of trace back this, what I call an ideology of value-free science. And, where does that come from? Has it always been like that? How has it changed? Was it really ever value-free? And what does that mean, science? Wasn't it just about knowledge? And hasn't that a longer tradition? Anyway, there is a lot to be said about that. And one of the things that strikes me when I look at the historical facts is that science is always, in the tension of different powers. And these are both political and economical powers. And it has to struggle for its survival, and it has to differentiate itself sometimes from that. As you can see, I mean, in our times, well, some people talk about post-factual, or I don't know what. Truth is under siege from many corners right nowadays. It's science. What kind of science do you have? The more it involves social values and social realities, the more contentious it becomes for certain interests. And that contributes to the fragility of the responsibility. Intuitively, everybody would say, oh yeah, that's good, let's have it. But in practice, there are conflicts coming up. And these conflicts contribute to also the funding priorities. And another note, the lack of dedicated funding for transdisciplinarity. Well, the point is, transdisciplinarity is not like business as usual. I mean, business as usual in the academics is a 2 or 3 year funding for a certain project, and then you do something else, right? This is typical a disciplinary project. Sometimes you have larger time spans, like 5 years. But in transdisciplinarity, you need a lot of time just first to interact with all the stakeholders. You need to prepare. You don't go out as an academic and tell them what the research is going to be. You design it together with them for a long time. And, you interact. So there's a long preparation phase. That needs some funding. You need, to be funded for that. And then you do the research, which again is a rather complicated, longer process. All of that is very different from traditional funding schemes, right? And you have to think about these expanded timeframes, and that hasn't come down. And it also, what is another thing that is different is the evaluation of the project. When do you succeed? Typically, research councils would always have, like the number of publications as a success criteria. That is not necessarily a success criteria for transdisciplinary project. There, it counts as how practical can that be? Can that make a change? Actionable knowledge. So you have to change these things. And that is something where also the funding agencies need to be educated over time.
Both the book and the Afino Center group responsible research and innovation with corporate social responsibility and lament their decline. We've also seen an erosion of the ESG, environmental, social, and governance framework as relevant for assessing investments in corporations after sustaining attacks, primarily in the United States, which is now accelerated under the new government there. You also mentioned earlier, and in the chapter title itself, the UN 2030 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. How are these frameworks related? You ask rhetorically a question in the article about a rebranding of the same agenda under various rubrics. How much is that happening here? And is the closure of the Afino Center representative of a waning commitment to this agenda in Europe?
Well, it's a very complicated question, but let's start with this, the connection between CSR and RI. I have a chapter earlier in the book about how these two sort of agendas can be connected in the sense that they're about testing out new ways of making these sectors responsive to society and to address the social legitimacy of respectively business and research and innovation community. So it's ways of sort of committing to respectively having business and research operations directed towards solving social challenges. And of course, adding the transdisciplinarity agenda, it's also about making these sectors work better together to solve these societal challenges. And yes, as you indicate, both of these terms have been through all these kind of ups and downs in terms of how popular they are and how new terms predate them and come after them. It's just about different ways of greenwashing or bluewashing these agendas. And of course, to a certain extent, it's always been used as this. So part of our idea with this book is to try to focus on the concept of responsibility and on how to ensure that the actors involved have the tools that they need to address this responsibility and to be responsible and to have this kind of infrastructure needed to address their operations towards solving sustainability goals or other challenges.
If I may address another issue in your question, I heard you say something about rebranding of the same agenda, ? And one can wonder about that. And I mean, the answer is both. Yes, in a way it can be, just don't talk about responsible research and innovation or CSR, corporate social responsibility. Use some other terms. And there have been other terms around, like you could talk about ethics, more ethics in there, right? Or other terms. And now, as Siri was mentioning, there is open science, this openness and inclusivity and all of that comes to the fore. In a way, you can say, oh yeah, maybe there is just some rebranding. On the other hand, terms do play sometimes a very decisive role. What we have experienced is in certain quarters in our society, in politics, industry, for example, the term ethics is not doing you any good. For many people see this as equate that with morality. You want to tell them what they ought to do. Ethics, that is not our understanding of the term ethics, It is more, as I said, value diversity and all of that. We have certain guidance for how we act. But there's a diversity, and it's not normative in the sense, but we can have normative reasoning about that. If you accept that, then maybe so-and-so and all of that. So some terms are politically more sensitive than others. I think I'm right to say Siri, we may feel that the term responsibility has unfortunately fallen out of it or have been victimized in that sense. It could have stayed. And I think in Europe, the ideas are still there, but the term has come in the background. Is it rebranding? Yeah, maybe to a certain extent, but we have to make sure that the content is there, right? The content of responsible research. And that's why we do this training. What does that mean for you as a researcher to be a responsible researcher? Who is it that you need to work with and all of that?
And it's also about sort of emphasizing the agency of it, right? So sustainability is not some external agenda that somebody else is putting. It's about us as agents and what we can do.
I want to ask you about Norway because you're both based in Norway, the Afino centers in Norway. The question of the country comes up, weighs heavily on the chapter. You set up Norway as both a paragon of transdisciplinary virtue and also Vice. At one point, you write that, quote, one may take a slightly optimistic outlook on how socially responsible science is practiced in Norway. Perhaps we can point to some achievements up here in the far north of Europe that are not mirrored in the rest of Europe, end quote. You paraphrase Gro Brundtland, asking, quote, is it typically Norwegian to be socially responsible, end quote. You also write that, quote, in the CSR literature, it's been argued that Nordic countries seem to share a culture of trust in institutions and flat decision structures, which is conducive to CSR. Cooperation and dialogue between different sectors of society, including industry, were promoted and often realized, end quote. When I read that, I immediately thought of Hofstede's power distance index, on which the Nordics tend to score on the lower end, and started wondering if Norway's economic circumstances help engender such cultural effects. Is Norway special?
We like to think so. I think but that's not all in Norway, I guess, but it's we do have a solid piece of that kind of a singularity view of ourselves as being something special.
Just note that I'm originally from Germany, right? So if I have a positive view of Norway, it's not because I am Norwegian, but because I realize certain things here. Go on, Siri.
Yeah, no, you're right. So we had that advantage when we wrote this together. So but yeah, when it comes to both the CSR agenda and the RI agenda, there are, I mean, as we showed through the book, there are some special features with Norway that may have some advantages, partly to do with us being a small and relatively homogeneous society, so that maybe it's in a way it's easier to test out some things, and because of the petroleum money and other issues, we've had a quite stable, good economy compared to many other countries. That also has maybe allowed us to test out some things. It has something to do for the CSR agenda. I guess it has also something to do with the kind of industry that we have in Norway. But the research that we refer to also shows that there's this kind of trust society characteristics and this sort of tradition of collaboration that has been argued is kind of that makes it easier to test out certain the parts of this agenda in Norway. But there are other, as we also point to, there are other sides that are less conductive of this agenda. And maybe, Matthias, you want to mention some of them?
Well, yeah, but before that, I just want to repeat basically what you say in other words. I do think, and that is my very personal observation, Norway is a culture of trust. The default attitude when you get different people and different groups together is trust and listen to the others first before you disagree and, think that they are rational beings. You sit around and discuss things in peace. So it's this old ting idea, like a parliament, right? There's a long tradition. But so it's community oriented and it's trust based and it's an equity between the participants, which is not necessarily the case in other countries, which are much more individualistic, for example. And there's a lot of distrust when there are different interests around and all of that. So that makes it maybe a little bit special, I would say, yes, in that respect. On the other hand, and these are the factors that come in here as well as others, Norway is not a saint among all these sinners that hold, economic incentives. Here are very strong economic incentives as well. We have the oil industry, fishing. I mean, there's a lot of big money as well, and they contribute to bias. And maybe, some things fall out in order to promote these strong interests. And also, sometimes there are issues where you feel that, maybe that touches too much of your national identity when, maybe our farmers are maybe not as sustainable as some researchers, want them to be. All of these conflicts also come up. There are conflicts that also would come up in other countries, right? So that we are subject to the same pressures. But we have a little bit better starting point, I think, in Norway.
You do lament in the article that in Norway, systemic transformation and true transdisciplinarity failed to diffuse through the Norwegian Research Council and the research and innovation system in Norway, quote, continues to operate on the basis of a quite linear view of the relationship between science and the world, end quote. You also specifically identify a lack of integration of indigenous knowledge into policy, something you touched on earlier. And you compare the country disfavorably to Canada, South Africa, and New Zealand. And you also specifically mention the, quote, Norwegian self-image of a homogenous society that gives little room for diversity, end quote. So I'm confused. This completely objective assessment that Norway is some responsible research innovation utopia, or is it responsible research innovation hell?
Can't we be both? No, I mean, we're a small country. We're very much a part of specifically Europe and the Europe Research and Innovation Agenda. We're full members of the framework programs and so on. So, and also economically speaking, we are completely dependent, although we sometimes like to pretend that we are, since we're not, for example, we're not the members of the EU. But we are fully dependent on whatever is the European agenda, both when it comes to research and economy as such. And our economy is very raw material based. So, of course, we can't pretend that we're just doing things in isolation and testing out things without the... So when it comes to sort of this quarter of the Research Council in Norway who funded the Afino project, who said, let's try this out. I mean, allowing for this quote-unquote spot treatment, going from there to actually revolutionizing the Norwegian research and innovation system would take something much more. And to be quite honest, it would take simultaneous transformation of the whole, at least the European system. Don't you agree, Matthias?
I think Norway has, it has certain advantages which makes it easier for that kind of research that we were interested in with the Afino project to start, right? But then it has the same mechanisms that may hinder it. And there are some additional mechanisms that also come in. What we mentioned, you quoted that, for example, indigenous knowledge systems. Norway has basically what I think is the only indigenous culture in Europe, right? I mean, the Sami people, I wouldn't know now immediately any other indigenous culture.
Well, you have Greenland in theory.
Well, Greenland, yes, right. That is true.
We still count that as Europe. I mean, these things, who knows?
And I have experience from both New Zealand and Canada in particular with how that was going on. And I think Norway has a lot to learn about the integration of that knowledge. There are many people who are studying the Sami people here in Norway, right? They are object of the study, but they are not integrated as subjects that are actively contributing with their knowledge and defining that. And which is a much better integration, I think, at least to start with, in other countries. So that has to do with sensitivities. Every country is a little bit sensitive when you point out, oh, maybe your history with those indigenous people has been not so good all the time, right? So there is a sensitivity. But in the end, I think there will be a willingness to improve, right? And learning. I mean, this transdisciplinary idea is also a global idea, right? This is not only a national thing. It has to be a global activity, and we have to learn from each other. So, and the Norwegian self-image, yes, it's difficult to acknowledge, I think, for most countries now. Listen, we see this in the political scene, to actually realize what that means. If you're not so homogeneous as you think you are, right? There is multiple cultures living in your country and identifying with your country, right? But there's a multiplicity there. How do you deal with that? That's difficult for most countries to take in, Norway as well.
I want to ask you about the fossil fuel industry, which you suggested sets Norway apart and predisposes it to be more able to fund projects such as the Afino Center and Responsible Research and Innovation. You refer to an example in the chapter of a complaint made in 2014 that the University of Bergen was using funds from the oil industry to promote what is essentially an unsustainable form of the industry. And you write that, quote, the rector decided to send this question to the NENT, the NENT, with reference to the ethical goal of sustainability in science. NENT concluded, among other things, that NENT believes that it is irresponsible in terms of research ethics if the framework conditions and research activities of petroleum research hinder adjustment processes so that the UN's climate goals, which Norway has committed to, cannot be achieved. As a consequence, the funding practices at the UIB, the University of Bergen, were changed, end quote. I have so many questions about this incident and what it represents more broadly. Did the University of Bergen permanently disinvest from unsustainable oil? Is all oil unsustainable? And do you see this case study as a model for future responsible research and innovation practices?
Our example is mentioned in context of sort of describing what do we have in Norway that's kind of special. And this system we have with National Ethics Committee for the different parts of academia is kind of special. And Matthias and I, we both have experience from this NENT committee on natural sciences and technology. And this case is kind of iconic in the sense that it challenged the whole system. I mean, all Norwegian universities, or at least the major ones, receive quite much funding from Equinor, from the Norwegian National Oil Company, and collaborates quite closely with the petroleum industry in this sense. And so this case was really a challenge about what is responsible research, what is ethical in terms of this kind of collaboration. The conclusion, as you quoted, was about what forms of petroleum research would be unethical, and it's about if you have kinds of research that sort of hinders the green transition or the transition to less dependence on fossil fuels. So one might imagine, of course, different forms of, or there are different forms of what we would call petroleum research and innovation, which does not, which is about sort of making sure that it could be about ensuring health and safety for people working there. It could be about environmentally improving the production that would in any case take place. It could be about a responsible dismantling of petroleum production facilities and so on. So the conclusion was not let's stop everything, have all collaboration, and let's let the petroleum industry do things on their own, because that wouldn't be very responsible. It was about how we as a research community can contribute to a responsible green transition.
And that kind of funding should not be in the way for, looking at more sustainable energy sources and that research about that, right? I mean, it shouldn't be a hinder of it. And that is, I think, the idea. And as Siri was saying, it's going anyway, so let's contribute in a positive way without committing to, fossil fuels as the future energy source, right? That is not.
But this is your home university, Matthias, that it actually made it a difference in how the University of Bergen collaborated with the petroleum industry.
Yeah, and I mean, I love that process, right? It was from one professor in the natural science faculty who said, hey, folks, we are getting all that money here, and we use that for the oil industry research. But there are the national guidelines where we should contribute to sustainable development. Here, rector of the university, isn't that a sort of inconsistent, right? And what should we do? And the rector said, oh, yes, you're right. I think that's difficult. Let's play it back to the committee and let's listen to what they have to say. And they listened.
And they asked all the other universities. So this kind of sparked debates and discussions around the whole country.
You write something near the end of the article that I loved so much. I just want to read it out loud. You wrote, quote, many people stick to the idea that objectivity as a scientific gold standard implies the exclusion of non-reductionist alternative approaches, and that all indeterminacies, except in quantum physics, are due to our epistemic uncertainty, which in the long run can disappear and lead to convergence. End quote. Can you tell us more about that? I love that. Can you elaborate? What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I have to, what you say in English, come out of the cupboard as one that believes in post-normal science. It's a term, and many people go, oh, what is that? All postmodernism or whatever. It is a term that was coined by two authors, Silvio Fontovich and Jerome Roberts, who in the early 90s wrote an article about post-normal science, which then got established as a term. And post-normal means basically it is not a an activity that is restricted to what goes on in a discipline and a department, right? It has a social impact. It's science for policy, science for social change. And they basically said, hey, in these cases, what is happening is that, all the values are in dispute. There are high system uncertainties. We always deal with high system uncertainties. And the stakes are very high. So if we make a wrong decision, then something happens that is a big harm. But still, we have to make a decision, and that rather soon, right? So that is the typical science policy situation. You never know all the facts. You have to deal with values that are in dispute, and there is a lot of uncertainties around and all of that. And it's, very costly if you make a mistake. And that idea is basically what carries that thought. And then it means also that the so-called objectivity of science, which, by the way, is an idea that only came around in the 19th century. It's nothing that goes all the way back, So excluding subjectivity was only coming up then. Anyway, in that sense, what it is, it's basically a revolution to say that, hey, you asking about the truth of it is maybe the wrong issue. Because we are living in a world of uncertainty, and we are living in a world of ambiguity. What we have to ask is the quality of the knowledge. Is it good enough for purpose? Is it good enough to make a decision in the one way or the other? Right? That's a quality criteria, right? And managing the uncertainties, managing the values. And this is what, if you think this through, that leads you to transdisciplinarity, because all of a sudden, who is an expert on values? Not necessarily the philosopher or the theologian or the lawyer or so. No, basically, or any other discipline, academic discipline, it's all of us. We are experts on our values. That's what democracy is all about, right? So we need to consult with them. So the peer review that we had in disciplinary sort of sciences needs to be expanded into a much larger community, right? And that is about then the, more including these epistemic uncertainties and all of that.
But without giving up the concept of truth, though.
No, of course. We don't want to give up the concept of truth. I mean, the lie is the worst thing, right? Yeah, and when we know it's wrong, there's nothing to do about it.
And this is not just to come to the market with my truths, my scientific truth, as opposed to your scientific truths and so on. There's still quality. There's still a criteria for good and bad science and so on. But it's about expanding. And it's about, of course, also understanding that the knowledge is always had from a perspective and reflecting on that.
And we saw that, for example, in the pandemic, right? I mean, you had one model from this research center and another model from that research center. And sort of you have all these, which model is right? There's a lot of uncertainty about it, right? How do we manage that uncertainty? How do we evaluate that? And who's going to evaluate that, right? So all of these questions come up. And that is what lies behind that quote that you have there.
That's lovely. I love that. I'd like to close this conversation as you close your article and indeed the book by looking forward and asking you what would be your top 3 recommendations to best promote a transformative research and innovation system in the years to come.
Well, we do have a couple of sort of very general advice towards the end of our chapter. So sort of we're trying to, because we've been sort of painting this sort of broad picture of the situation both in Norway and in the world. So we're trying to sort of towards the end be a little bit more sort of concrete in our advice, because it's also kind of it's also giving something back to the Research Council, which they asked for in funding us. So it's also this. So we think that it is about funding schemes. It is about incentive systems. It's about renewing the way we think about projects and deliverables and outcomes, sort of good results from research.
Basically, these are what you can say systemic or structural proposals, right? We need to change the funding system and also the assessment system. for research, and we need to be more inclusive in our research designs, all of that. In addition, something that we haven't said so much about, but which our Afino project was about, is actually we have to keep up our ambitions and emotions that we have as young scientists, because you want to make a change when you're young, right? You want to do this for a purpose. You want to help maybe a special group where you come from or your region or whatever, right? Stick to that. I think, and that is, it's sometimes hard if you go into academic life. You are lost in career structures and all of that, and you adopt certain standards of quality that may be not so helpful. But stick to your ambitions, stick to your values, and see how you can realize that together with others. Go out of your borders. Don't accept when other people limit you in a box. Go out of that box. Look for others. Share your knowledge with them and learn from them. I mean, that is, I think, the psychological lessons that we had in our Afino project.
You're here. This has been a beautiful conversation. I've really, really appreciated having you both on the program with us to dig deeper into these questions. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Ramzi. Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramzi. It's been a pleasure.
That was Doctors Siri Granum Carson and Matthias Kaiser. And this has been Sustainability Matters. As always, you can participate. Tell us what you think of the Sustainability Matters podcast. If you would like us to cover any specific topics in this format in future episodes, or if you have thoughts about responsible research that you'd like us to take up, write to us and let us know. We're at podcast@brill.com, and we'd love to hear from you. If enough of you write to us about responsible research or any other topic related to sustainability in scholarly publishing and beyond, we do promise to explore it in another episode. For now, I will say thank you again for being with us. I'm your host, Ramzi Nasser. See you next month.
You are listening to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill.